Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. This is the introduction for Chapter 5. I'm going to be covering 3 stories across this particular chapter. First off, I'm going to be elevating the 1988 score baseball set to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame's Binder of Fame. So that's going to be a fun thing to do. And then I'm also going to be talking about lenticular cards. And I also want to talk about the 1968 Nolan Ryan Topps rookie card. And that's actually a good place to start. So in the case of the Topps rookie for Nolan Ryan, that is, well, it's kind of redundant to say that, but at any rate, for the Nolan Ryan rookie card, the thing that really makes that card significant, and the reason it's an important story, is because Nolan Ryan occupied a very unique space basically during the junk wax era heading into the 1990s. During that span, his rookie card was kind of discovered in a way. And in that, we were able to get a gem of a card that really meant a lot to us. So the reason that Nolan Ryan's rookie card, the reason that Nolan Ryan was so important at that time is because over the course of sports, there are players who kind of define eras. So you have players like Babe Ruth, you have Mickey Mantle, you have Hank Aaron was the last player who really truly defined an era. After Hank Aaron, there really wasn't much else. You had, to a certain extent, you kind of had it with Pete Rose and you kind of had it with Reggie Jackson. Those players in the 70s and into the 80s, they did a pretty good job of defining the era, but they weren't really transcendent. And that's the thing that you have over the years, whether you're looking at Ty Cobb or Shoeless Joe Jackson, you're looking at players who stand higher than the sport itself, and they really do define that time as the great player that you were so lucky to watch. Everybody was lucky to watch. And after Hank Aaron, there just wasn't much of that in pretty much all of sports. You did have a couple of cases of players outside of baseball who kind of held up. But in baseball, there was a lot of turnover. There just wasn't some spectacular figure who really captured everybody's imagination. And even there were a couple of players who seemed to do that. So Don Mattingly was a player who everybody was really excited was going to be the next Mickey Mantle. We started by the 90s to realize that wasn't going to be the case. And then Bo Jackson had an amazing run that tragically ended very, very quickly. And while we would have Ken Griffey Jr. come up, it was going to take a while to actually find him. So we had essentially 2 decades where we just didn't have a superstar that defined baseball and really defined sports in a way. So by the time that the junk wax era hit, there was a lot of excitement going on because we were getting really excited about rookies and we were following these hot prospects. But there was a bit of a tumultuous evolution of how everything was going, and we were all kind of stranded because we were having so much fun with all the things that were going on, but there was no overarching superstar. And that's what Nolan Ryan was able to provide us with. He was not somebody who came out of nowhere. Everybody knew who Nolan Ryan was. He was one of the best pitchers in baseball. But it was when he turned 40 that all of a sudden we clicked onto him. We realized that he was something special because nobody who was 40 years old was a star. There were some players who were just kind of going through the motions at the end of their career at 40 years old. But Nolan Ryan essentially celebrated his 40th birthday by throwing a no-hitter. Not on the day, but right around that time. And for crying out loud, he did it the next year afterwards, which gave him 7 no-hitters, which is just an astronomical number of no-hitters. He's doing that in his 40s. He still had one of the fastest fastballs in baseball. So an entire generation of sports fans all of a sudden found this guy who was a true transcendent legend. And we started to lock onto him. He only had a couple of years where he was truly a dominant figure in the sport where we were all paying attention. But when it happened, we knew that this was truly one of those cases where it stands alongside great players like Hank Aaron, where what he did was something that was going to be remembered for a long time. Unfortunately, it has kind of tapered off a little bit, but still, it was somebody who could galvanize us all around this phenomenal event of watching a guy who was in his 40s still be dominant. And at that time, it was not the kind of thing that you thought about. The name that kept popping up during this time was George Blanda. And George Blanda was a quarterback and kicker in the NFL, and he played till 40. And that was amazing to see. So here Nolan Ryan came out and was doing essentially the same thing. Now, when I'm doing this video, we already have Tom Brady, Drew Brees, we have LeBron James, we have a number of players who are doing essentially that. But it's a different era, and players are being groomed to have long careers. The rules in the games are designed to allow players to continue late in their career. It's not as rough on them. But that just wasn't the case with Nolan Ryan. So Nolan Ryan came out of nowhere and really caught our attention. And so as we now started to pay extra attention to Nolan, we were obviously collecting his cards all the way back to, well, his rookie card was in the 60s. And this threw us for a loop. We had other great players at the time. We had guys like Robin Yount and George Brett, and even over in other sports, we had Joe Montana, we had Magic Johnson, we had Larry Bird. These guys were still playing or were at the point of retirement at that time. We were looking at their rookie cards, and they were in the 80s and into the 70s. That's where rookie cards were happening. And with Nolan Ryan, it was way back in the 60s, deep in the heart of the vintage era. For crying out loud, Mickey Mantle's in that card set. It was absolutely bizarre to see this incredible situation where we had a player who made sense to us, who we related to, who dated all the way back to that old era where our parents were fans. And that was what really captured the attention of this card. This card stood out. See, we had two kinds of collectors. We had vintage collectors and we had modern collectors. And modern collectors were kind of interested in vintage, and some of the vintage guys were kind of interested in modern cards. But there wasn't really a big crossing, because when you get into vintage, it's a whole nother language. But Nolan Ryan gave us a special key to unlock that, because we look back at a player we knew, who we wanted to follow, who was in that vintage era. And so it really inspired our imagination, because now all of a sudden there was a card that mattered to us that was a part of that family of ethereal cards that were so expensive, so rare, so special. And it thus became an iconic card. So I'm going to be doing a follow-up video where I'm going to focus on that card and really talking more about Nolan Ryan and why he was so special, and why he dominated our attention during that brief period of time. This is what I'm going to say here in this essentially a teaser. And so now I'm going to move on and talk a bit about lenticular cards. This is, again, I'm going to be doing videos of all three of these topics separately. With lenticular cards, this is a case of a situation where you look at this and you think of it both as older than it really is and newer than it really is. The technology seems like it should be... The whole concept of the gimmick of lenticular cards seems ancient. But at the same time, it's surprising to know just how far back it went, because lenticular cards for us started to appear in the late 60s and the early 70s. That's when they showed up, which seems like a long time ago for this kind of technology to show up. And yet, when you look at the cards that we knew in the 1980s, it really does kind of fit. It's just kind of bizarre, because the technology really was developed way, way, way long before cards existed. And by the time they were being made as cards, it was old technology. And in the late 60s and early 70s, when we first started to see them, the technology was used in a wonderful way, because it gave motion to cards. It gave three-dimensional effects. The cards now had a quality to them where they were interactive. We did have some actual literal 3D cards with relief, and we had some cards that had kind of gimmicky qualities. But nothing had that kind of 3D effect or motion effect or that kind of a concept. That was just something that blew everybody away. And it continued all the way through the 1970s as a fun little gimmick insert in cereal and stuff like that. But nobody was doing it with main release cards for very good reason. It is a gimmick. And it's more expensive than the basic cards that are just churned out by Topps and Fleer and Don Russ. So it never had any reason to show up in the mainstream of cards. But in the mid-1980s, one of these card companies decided that they were going to become one of the big players. They were going to become the fourth card. And that was Sportflix. That's what they created. And these were lenticular cards where they focused not on special motion, etc., but actually on 2 or 3 or 4 images that just jump back and forth. It was a different way of looking at cards, so that was cool. But collectors never really locked onto these cards because they were a gimmick and they just didn't make sense for traditional collecting. So that set, Sportflix, continued all the way through 1990, and they hung in there and they just never quite made a card that really worked. They made another run in the mid-90s with Sportflix and Sportflix, and there they did a better job of designing the cards, but still they were using the clunky 2-image phase. And it's weird to think that in the 1970s the cards were very lively and energetic and exciting, and here they weren't being done that way, except the inserts actually were. And what we ended up finding was that the 2 years that Sportflix existed in the mid-90s, the set itself didn't hold up, but the inserts did. And so we started to see inserts showing up in various places, and some of these inserts are among the more desired cards from the era. But the lenticular card concept had basically got overpassed by holograms. When Upper Deck started doing holograms, it was a game changer, and everybody looked at it and said, that's amazing. Because lenticular cards were just 2 images or 3. It was really clunky. But that's because collectors weren't seeing what had been done way in the past. And so by the mid-90s, holograms weren't really holding up. They weren't that big of a deal. But now seeing the liveliness of a 3D effect on a lenticular card, that reshaped the hobby, and it really captured people with a technology that was a lot older than the relatively new holograms that we were just barely seeing. In fact, interestingly enough, you skip ahead to 2008, 2009, Upper Deck, of all companies, started doing lenticular cards in their sets. Not a lot of them, but they did some. They were not doing holograms. So that means that in the late 60s you had lenticular cards, in the late 80s you had lenticular cards, in the late 2000s, 2009 you had lenticular cards. That's the kind of span we're talking about, 40 years that these cards could continue to capture our imagination. So it's an amazing technology that is underutilized because you can do multiple images, that's fine. You can do a 3D effect, and you can also put game film on these cards, which gives the ability to watch a whole portion of a play. Watching action on cards, it was amazing what these cards were able to do if your imagination was right for it. The cards don't usually get the due that they deserve because they're not gold foil, and they don't have brushed metal, and they don't have these kinds of qualities, refractors, that we see more in the mainstream. They're very specialized, but when done right, they can capture anybody's imagination. So again, I'm going to do a standalone video about that, but the reason I wanted to talk about this prior to the card that I'm elevating to the Binder of Fame is because Sportflix, they did a couple of years, they weren't quite making it. And so the owners of Sportflix decided they wanted to make a card that could compete head-to-head with the big 3 traditional cards. They wanted to make a traditional card, so they made a set called Score in 1988. And the Score set was absolutely revolutionary because even by the mid-1980s, the 3 companies were still making cards pretty much the way that they had been made post-war by Leaf and Bowman. The card technology was better, the printing was better, there was definitely some evolution, as you would expect to happen over multiple decades. But it was still a similar card stock. Yes, Fleer and Don Russ was a better card stock, but still a similar cardboard card stock with a similar surface on the front. The back was monochromatic. Maybe they might stuff a picture on there, but it's hardly a readable picture. And then the front, the design was better, but still, it fell into the same trap of all the cards look the same around the border, etc., etc., etc. Score changed all of that. So a company that was built around making lenticular cards, which was very unique, when they went to make a regular card, they also went unique. They went very high tech. They had a whole different card stock, a very firm card stock. This allowed full color printing on the back with high quality images. Whether they actually printed with high quality is not the point, because now they had a card that was built for high quality card backs that had more room, more ability to put text on there, better images, etc. Card fronts, they had a more lively card design. The card design itself may have been kind of simplistic and not hold up very well over the years, but they had different colors for borders. They were thinking very much outside of the box. And the result was that they created something that did nothing to impact the big three. Topps, Fleer, and Donruss kept making the same cards for years. But everybody else started out making cards the way that Score made them. Score laid out a very clear benchmark of this is what modern cards are. And moving forward, everybody did at least that, if not more, with honorable mention for NBA Hoops. And you can even see it very well because in 1989, when Pro Set made its first set, it basically made 88 Score flipped upside down. Otherwise, it's very, very similar, which begs the question, if Score wasn't there, would Pro Set have made a card more along the lines of Fleer and Donruss? It's quite possible they may have. But by Score establishing a brand new standard that everybody would have to follow, they truly did define cards moving forward. And their benchmark was, you got to be making it as good as this, if not more. And for anybody who started in the sport, starting in 1989, they understood that cards either were like the scorecards or could be like scorecards. It was a whole generation that thought of cards in a very different way than anybody who had been collecting in 1987 and 1988. For collectors during that time, their mentality of cards was different. But by 1990, we all thought about cards in a more modern way. And by 1991, it was just weird to see the old cardboard stock. That's how quick the hobby changed. And Score established that. It may not be the flashiest card, it may not be the sexiest card, it may not have any famous cards at all in the card set. All of that may be true. May not have aged well, yada, yada, yada. All of that is accurate. This is a card you're easily going to overlook, but it is the most important card set ever created because it reset the card market, the whole hobby. Everybody had to change, starting with that point. It is day one of the true modern card era, and everything we know today comes from that. So again, I'm going to do a standalone video for that, do one for lenticular cards, and do one for Nolan Ryan. So definitely look out for those videos when they come out. If you haven't subscribed, I urge you to do so, and do ring the notification bell so that you know when these videos come out. And I think I'm going to bring it to a close, so thank you very much for watching.